I am, I am, I am. The voice of my God booms liquid words, a constant mantra for as long as I can remember. God's voice is with me, surrounding me, warm, steady and powerful. For a long time, that is all there is. I am, I am, I am. Then I was given hands enough to touch and reach enough to explore. With that perpetual benediction all around me, I struck out in search of my God, and I touched my brother's face. We lie together in paradise, and I realized that I was alone before, but I am no longer alone. In this closeness, I can hear the faint echo of God's words pulsing inside him, beating against his chest, and for the first time I feel that tiny rhythm inside my own body also. I am, I am, I am. The warmth around us contracts, and my brother and I cling to one another in silent fright. God's voice pounds angrily in our ears, and our world shudders again. Suddenly, he is pulled from my grasp. I try to hold on to him, but his foot is slick, and I lose my grip, and I am alone again, surrounded by rough words and the rapid hammering response within my own chest. My world presses in on me, ejects me, forces me out into a cold which rushes to greet me like a slavering scavenger. Terror clutches me as I thrash around in emptiness. I can no longer hear God. I cry out. Once. Am I? The dream ended suddenly, but Adam was not suddenly awake. His head floated on the pillow and he tried to dive back down. There was a crack in the curtains, though, and a finger of late morning sun poked at his face, harassing him reluctantly into the real world. He stirred further, rubbing at his eyes, and felt Cassie move beside him. He squirmed gracelessly to face her, in time to see her nose wrinkle in denial of the daylight. "Morning," he said softly. She made a noise of protest. "Typical student," he muttered, as he stroked her stomach underneath the bedclothes. "It's all right for you, drop out," she slurred. "You were dreaming all night, all over the place, muttering and twitching, keeping me awake. Please tell me I've missed my 9 o'clock lecture." "I don't remember any dreams," he said. "You are joking." "What did I say?" "Nothing, just nonsense words. Now shut up and let me sleep through my 11 o'clock. "It's Saturday," Adam said, matter-of-factly, to her back as she rolled away from him, dragging most of the covers with her. She harumphed an acknowledgement and hunkered down deeper into the covers. Reaching for the floor on his side of the bed, Adam retrieved his cigarettes and an empty beer can that he'd been using as an ashtray. He smoked a philosophical cigarette, and about half an hour later Cassie turned back round, more awake now, and snaked an arm round his waist. "Saturday," she said. "Uh-huh." She kissed his chest and wriggled a little closer, letting her hand glide down to his thigh. "Have you decided whether you're going to see her?" she asked. Her nails traced the inside of his thigh and made his heart beat faster. "I haven't decided," he said. "Because if you are going," a rude smile played across her lips, "I'll have to give you your birthday present now." Her fingers stopped playing and she ducked her head beneath the covers. By now his heart was pounding expectantly in his chest. After a few stations had passed, Adam relaxed a little more into the swaying rhythm of the train. He laid his head back and gazed out of the smeared window, the nap of the seat cover brushing his cheek as he rocked slightly. Urban greys rushed past the scratched no smoking sticker on the window, and it was not long before they gave way to terraced back gardens and splashes and streaks of green. As the train slowed for each station, he became more attentive, mentally ticking them off a list that brought him closer to his destination. Between stations, though, his mind wandered with the syncopated clacking of the tracks. He closed his eyes against the sun, which was angling into his carriage, turning it a curious yellow, and behind his eyelids the sunlight became red and veiny, flashing and pulsing. In between those flashes, his memory began to grasp at the ragged tatters of his dream, which were still flapping at the back of his mind. Running. The sun warmed his face and the train rocked him gently, running through plush gardens, the dew cooling his feet, impossible fruits hanging heavy upon trees, their sweet juices spilling down his grinning chin. The sun above him sending down warmth and love in hot, regular waves. The long grass tripping him, soft falling, rolling through the undergrowth, his heart beating in time with the pulsing heat above. The train lurched and slowed, breaking his reverie. Bricks and buildings had built up again outside the window, and the train was coasting now, gliding towards the station. He pushed himself up from his seat and made his way to the end of the carriage. Once the train juddered to its final stop, Adam opened the door and hopped down. Few other people were disembarking. He headed for the bridge that would take him across to the other side of the tracks and out into the afternoon. Outside the station, a woman was selling flowers from a small stall. Adam paused, decided, then strolled over to the stall. Making his way to his mother was a little like playing hide-and-seek with déjà vu. It had been just over 3 years since he'd last been here, and in that time new shops amongst old buildings blurred the familiar just enough to keep him uneasy. Good son. He'd been thinking of visiting for a while now, but in all honesty it had been Cassie who'd provided the impetus. Once he'd finally opened up to her, expressed his regrets, explained a little about the events before he'd met her, she'd simply said, "Why not just go?" And he couldn't come up with an answer. Maybe he'd get her some flowers on the way back if the stall was still there. The further he walked from the station, the more the bustle and traffic was replaced by quieter streets, houses instead of shops. Eventually he was walking with more certainty. His memories of this town hadn't been as vague as he'd thought. They just needed a little dusting. Cassie had been right about this. It would be good for him. He decided that he'd call her on his way back, and perhaps she could meet him at the train and they could go out for a drink. He could see the steeple between the houses now, and he clutched his thinly wrapped flowers a little tighter. At the end of the street he turned left, slipping into the shadow of a grand oak tree, taking the slight incline at a steady pace. The church was emerging now, and a rook was cawing somewhere in the grounds. The Church of the Immaculate Passion. He passed through the gate, and the pebbled path that led to the main entrance clicked underfoot. He followed it for a few paces before cutting across the grass, making his way to the rear of the building. He weaved his way around slanting headstones and made his way towards her. He came up quietly behind her and stood for a few moments, heart in his throat a little, before softly saying, "Hello, Mum." The rook cawed again, further away now. "I've brought some flowers," he said, feeling a little foolish, but he laid them down all the same, in front of her headstone. I am a ghost of sorts, existing inside a pre-birth memory that is never called upon. I'm part of a reptilian brain. What remains of me is that part which went with my brother when we were expelled, split and moulded from the same materials. I coursed through his blood and swell in his chest and thud in his ears, but he cannot hear me. He is forgetting. Cassie noticed a difference in him almost straight away. Nothing drastic, but a little something nonetheless. A few days passed before she could put her finger on what it was, though. They were out for the evening, some small pub on the way to see a movie, and he was saying, "I'm remembering so much more about her since I went to the grave. It's like I'd locked myself out from my own childhood, but it's all coming back, you know, the good times." That was when she realised he's not frowning. Over the next few months, his smile came more easily. She found ways of getting closer to him that had been blocked off before. Cassie eased cautiously into this new stage of their relationship, but never spoke to him about it for fear of scaring it away. He spoke more hopefully about finding a job, talked more openly about everything. They talked more and touched more and shared silences. She felt this new thing that clamoured in her heart to be named, but she ignored it. Best to let it alone, she thought. Best not to lean on it now while it's too fragile. One night she woke, slowly disorientated, and he was on one elbow, leaning over her. "What?" she murmured. "You were having a nightmare," he said. She made a noise. I don't remember." He kissed her forehead, laid back down, and turned over. For a horrible instant, she lay in fright that everything between them had been a dream, that things weren't really changing, but sleep stole back quickly, and the stab of fear vanished as soon as she moulded herself against his back. She fell asleep listening to his breathing and the beating of his heart. "How did the interview go?" Cassie asked at the front door. "Pretty good. You coming up?" Adam jogged up the stairs, and she gently closed the front door and followed. She could hear his music before she was even on the landing, and she heard him turn it down before she reached his room. "Cup of tea?" he asked from the other side of the bedsit, reaching for a half-smoked cigarette that balanced on the ashtray. The window was open and he placed himself on the windowsill, leaving the only chair in the room free for her. He was still wearing his shirt and tie from the job interview, and she studied him approvingly. "Have you been burgled?" She cast an arm around the room in general before tiptoeing through the clutter on the floor towards the chair. "Just going through some of my mum's stuff." He held his cigarette out to her and she shook her head. "When will you hear?" she asked. "Oh, they're interviewing all next week, so not for a fortnight at least. Treating it as a practice run rather than getting my hopes up, to be honest. Look, check this out." He leaned across his bed, plucked something off the duvet and handed it to her. "A photo album." "Oh my God," Cassie squealed. "Little baby Adam." She flipped through the photos at turns, eyeing, then giggling. "There's one right at the front." He was leaning over her shoulder now. "Must have been taken when I was only a few hours old." She flipped to the front, and indeed there was a picture, all on its own. A tiny baby wrapped in a white blanket, eyes closed. "Sickly child," Cassie murmured. "Poor lighting," he said, "but you're almost blue." She flipped the photo over. On the back, in thin blue biro, was a date, Adam's birthday, and a quote. "And they shall be one flesh, one heart, one soul. Emma," she read. She flipped the picture back over to consider the tiny, pale face. Months passed and the dreams still came, creeping up slowly, almost nightly now, rising from the coccyx, residual tail of forgotten memory, climbing the curved spine, each vertebra like a rung on Jacob's ladder, bubbling into the skull to broil and billow in the back of the sleeping mind that lay there. Dreams of Adam in the garden, falling, hugging the earth. Dreams of Adam at a mirror, pushing through the mercurial surface, at play with his reflection, forming strangely limbed creatures, all fleshy loops and melted forms. Dreams of Adam gagging, pulse pounding in his throat, coughing up his heart to steam and throb on the floor. Not one heart, though, but two small, eager organs joined like cherries with a stalk of artery. Cassie was there sometimes, pulling one of these feeble hearts from its stem and swallowing it. Adam kneeling at her feet, head to her belly, listening to the contented beats coming from within. With the mornings, with consciousness, these dreams would fade. Viewed only in periphery, in the last puffs of sleeping, they became remembered by the uneasiness they left behind. The Leviathan never seen, only the disturbance in the water after its sounding. Every morning Cassie would wake to this uncanny sense of loss, like the face of a childhood friend that memory couldn't conjure. Every morning she would awake before Adam with a name almost on her lips, and then daylight beat its way into her thoughts. Every morning she would watch him sleeping, listen to him breathing, and keep the feeling from him once he awoke. She just let him sleep. "You look tired," Adam said, looking into Cassie's dark eyes. "We can go another time," she shushed him. "I told you I'd come," she said. "I want to come." "You still not getting a decent night's sleep?" he asked. Above them the numbers on the station's clock flipped over, and the milling crowd began to shuffle their feet expectantly. He craned his neck down the track to see if he could spot their train and slipped his hand into hers. She let her head sag onto his shoulder, and he said to her, "Rest on the train if you want." The journey seemed shorter to Adam this time. He didn't want to keep Cassie in the cemetery too long, so if she perked up a little, he'd probably suggest a stroll through the town or a pub lunch. If not, then he'd get her home nice and early. Cassie tried to close her eyes, but the jolting sway of the carriage dislodged too many thoughts, unsettled her. She made her excuses and stumbled down the lurching aisle to the toilets. In the small swaying room she felt nauseous and dry-retched a couple of times into the stainless steel stench of the bowl. Once they'd reached their stop, she was glad to be on the solid platform and took in lungfuls of air as though the cold might flush this uneasiness out of her system. All the time she could see unspoken concern in Adam's eyes, each small scrutiny of her well-being. She forced smiles to her lips and wished that she could settle herself for his sake. She couldn't walk as fast as Adam, so once they began their way to the church, it took longer than he'd expected. It was a full half hour before they spotted the steeple between the houses, and the easy slope to the empty place wore her out. The nausea had gone, though, and as Adam tried the locked door to the church so that she could sit down inside, Cassie said that she'd rather rest for a while on the bench in the graveyard. "Is there a bench there?" Adam asked, and they began to make their way to the rear of the church. "There's always a bench," she said, and although she'd never been here before, she knew there would be an old wooden bench underneath high, ivied railings. Sitting, she pulled her coat collar up and watched Adam stroll through this silent garden towards his mother's plot. In his long coat, with his legs hidden behind gravestones, he seemed to glide through the graveyard. She watched him for a few minutes until she felt like she was intruding upon something private. Then she looked up at the white autumn sky instead, traced the naked tree limbs, listened to the distant sounds of traffic. She wanted to go to his side. She wanted to see for herself, but it was calm here where she was sitting, and she was afraid of remembering her dreams of this place. She dreamt of Adam again. He'd been here, at his mother's grave, but not to see her. She dreamt him pulling the overgrowth away from the tiny headstone next to his mother's, clearing the leaves from the plot. It had been night time in the dream, but they'd both been able to read the worn inscription. Adam's birthday, the name, and the fragment of poetry taken. She knew this somehow from a book that Adam's mother had studied when she had been at university. His sister's grave. She watched him now, feet from the small grave that she knew was there. He was oblivious, and she wouldn't have said a word to snatch that innocence from him now that he was finally happy. In the dream he had been on his knees, digging his fingers into the moist earth as the drizzle patted his head and back with cold kisses, pulling up clumps of earth and pressing them to his face, feeling the sod that had lain between him and his sister for 19 years heave upwards slightly. Now he glanced over at her and she smiled. She saw him saying something to the ground, and then he was gliding back towards her through the gravestones as though he were a ghost already and she had met him too late. In her dream, the wind had pushed the gathering rain into his face as he tore at the ground. The loneliness beneath rose like a smell to greet him. He reached the tiny coffin. He clawed around the fragile wooden casket until he had enough purchase to lift the weightless load out, breathing heavily, feeling a throbbing from inside the box, wrenching the lid off and crying out. "You hungry?" he called out to her, and she shook her head. There she lay. The dream rushed back to her now, all of it. Reverently, he curled his hands under her as if she were a kitten and lifted the tiny skeleton out of the coffin. The smell of freshly dug earth filled his nostrils, and he cast the empty coffin aside, his head giddy, blood pounding in his ears. And ever so slowly, as if he were trying not to wake her, he dropped from his knees to one elbow, then finally down onto his side. He held her close, curling himself around her as the rain began to fall in earnest. The rain filled the hole, and Adam's shivering travelled through them both, giving her tiny form motion. The earth around them turned to mud and began to slide back into the ragged hole, but he didn't care. He lay his head next to hers and closed his eyes. "You look a little better," Adam said as he reached Cassie, dropping himself onto the bench beside her. She leaned across and kissed him lightly on the cheek. "Do you feel okay?" he asked. For a time, in her dream, before the mud closed over them completely, Adam and his sister shared his heartbeat between them and were at peace. "Do you feel okay?" Adam repeated, and Cassie nodded. He placed a light hand on her stomach, leaned conspiratorially towards it and whispered, "And what about you? Are you doing okay in there too?" Cassie answered for the girl. She knew it was a girl that was inside her. "I am."